Rage, fear, and hidden power collide when a racist cop crosses a dangerous line, brutally assaulting a black pregnant woman in broad daylight. But what he doesn't realize is that her husband is no ordinary man. By the next day, the entire town is left in shock as the officer's world unravels, exposing dark secrets he thought were long buried. This is a gripping tale of justice, vengeance, and one family's unbreakable bond. Stay with us to witness just how far a man will go to protect the ones he loves. The morning sun bathed the small town of Brooksville, Arkansas, in a golden glow. A gentle breeze whispered through the oak-lined streets, rustling the leaves like a quiet promise of peace. The day felt perfect, almost too perfect. Olivia Carter stepped onto the front porch of her stately white brick home, her radiant smile reflecting the warmth of the morning. She was a woman of grace and quiet strength, known for her kindness and generosity. But today was special. She had a plan, a heartfelt surprise for her husband Daniel, who had been away on a long business trip. Olivia, 6 months pregnant, cradled her growing belly, feeling the life within her stir. "You're going to love what I'm making for Daddy," she murmured to her unborn child, rubbing her belly with a gentle touch. A tiny kick in response made her chuckle. "I knew you'd like that." She loved these peaceful morning walks to the store. They gave her a moment of fresh air, a chance to move, and a reason to greet familiar faces. As she strolled through the neighborhood, friendly waves and warm smiles met her, a testament to how well she was loved in the community. Her pace was slow and steady, careful, deliberate. She was aware of every step she took, ensuring that she didn't overexert herself, but inside she was filled with excitement. She could already picture Daniel's expression when he walked through the door later that evening, tired from his trip, only to be met with the scent of his favorite meal. It had been too long since they had shared a special evening together, and tonight she wanted it to be perfect. Just as she reached the corner, her thoughts were abruptly shattered. The sharp screech of tires tearing against pavement sent a jolt of alarm through her. A police cruiser skidded to a stop right beside her, its presence an intrusive force against the peaceful morning. The driver's side window rolled down with a mechanical hum, revealing a face she barely recognized, but had heard about: Officer Kyle Mercer. He was new to town, but had already made a name for himself. The kind of name that left people uneasy. A man with a temper. A cop with a badge but no restraint. His cold, piercing gaze locked onto her, suspicion already etched into his hardened features, as if he had made up his mind about her before even speaking a word. "Stop right there," he barked, his tone sharp, laced with an authority that felt less like law enforcement and more like intimidation. Olivia's body tensed, a strange unease coiled in her stomach. She turned slowly to face him, keeping her voice calm but firm. "Excuse me?" And in that moment, the morning was no longer peaceful. It was the beginning of a nightmare. Olivia's breath hitched slightly, but she kept her voice steady, her tone soft yet firm. "Is there a problem, officer?" Kyle Mercer didn't respond right away. He simply stared at her, his expression unreadable but his eyes sharp, scrutinizing her every move. Then, without a word, he pushed open the car door and stepped out, his boots crunching against the pavement with deliberate force. The shift in his stance sent a ripple of unease through Olivia's body. He wasn't just patrolling. He wasn't just asking questions. He was hunting. "I need to see your ID," he ordered, his voice flat, but there was an edge to it, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Olivia hesitated. A flicker of unease turned into something sharper, something colder. "I'm just going to the store," she said carefully, keeping her tone neutral, refusing to let fear seep in. "Why do you need to see my ID?" Kyle's jaw tightened, the moment stretched between them, charged and brittle, before he suddenly snapped, "Because I said so." The words were like a slap, sharp and dismissive. His posture stiffened, his presence looming closer. "You're acting suspicious," he added, eyes narrowing. "I want to know what you're doing out here." A chill ran down Olivia's spine. Suspicious. The accusation made no sense. She had done nothing wrong, but the way he looked at her, the way his body tensed, made it clear that logic didn't matter here. He had already decided she was guilty of something she hadn't even done. Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to breathe deeply. "I'm not doing anything wrong," she said, her voice quieter now, but still steady. "I'm just picking up a few things from the store." Kyle's expression darkened. His lip curled in annoyance, as if her calmness only irritated him more. "Just show me your ID," he barked, cutting her off. Olivia swallowed hard and quickly fumbled in her purse. Her fingers trembled slightly as she retrieved her wallet, her skin prickling under the weight of his gaze. With a quiet exhale, she handed him her ID, hoping to diffuse whatever this was before it spiraled any further. As soon as Kyle snatched the card from her hand, a murmur rippled through the air. She could feel it. Eyes watching. People had begun to notice. A few passers-by slowed their steps, their expressions wary as they took in the scene. The tension was thick, suffocating. Kyle barely glanced at the ID before shoving it back into her hands. "What are you really doing out here?" he demanded, his tone laced with suspicion. Olivia's brows knitted together, frustration creeping past her fear. "I told you," she said, her voice rising just slightly. "I'm going to the store." "Can I go now?" she added, her patience fraying. But Kyle wasn't done. He took another step forward, his face mere inches from hers. The air between them grew stifling. "You think you can talk back to me?" he sneered. His voice was low, threatening. "You're acting like you have something to hide." The way he said it sent a shudder through Olivia. "I don't have anything to hide," she said, her voice unsteady now. "Please, I just want to go." And then everything happened at once. Kyle's face twisted with sudden fury. His voice rose, sharp and cutting. "Stop resisting," he bellowed. Olivia barely had time to react, her mind spinning in confusion. Resisting? She wasn't resisting anything. She hadn't moved, hadn't done anything except stand there. A murmur rippled through the growing crowd. People whispered, exchanged glances. Then, without warning, Kyle lunged forward. His hands shoved against her with brute force. Olivia stumbled, her feet struggling to find balance against the weight of her belly. The shock of it stole her breath. "Stop, please," she gasped, hands instinctively flying up in surrender, but it only seemed to provoke him further. His rage flared, his movements were quick, merciless. And before she or anyone else could react, Kyle pulled back his leg and kicked her. Right in the stomach. A searing pain exploded through Olivia's body as she crumpled to the ground, a desperate cry tearing from her lips. Her hands clutched her belly, her world tilting as agony consumed her. The last thing she heard before darkness threatened to take her was the sound of horrified gasps. Olivia lay on the ground, her body racked with pain, her vision blurred by the hot tears streaming down her face. For a moment the world around her seemed to freeze. The warm sunlight felt cruel against the horror unfolding on the quiet street. Then the silence shattered. Bystanders who had witnessed the brutal assault sprang into action, their shocked silence breaking into a flurry of panicked cries. "Call an ambulance!" someone shouted, their voice trembling with urgency. Others rushed to Olivia's side, horrified by what they had just seen. A pregnant woman, vulnerable and innocent, attacked without reason. "Please, hang on!" A woman knelt beside Olivia, her face pale with fear. "Help is coming!" Her voice was small, fragile, as if she were trying to comfort herself against a terror too overwhelming to comprehend. Meanwhile, Officer Kyle stood back, his face cold and expressionless. The air around him was thick with outrage, the crowd's disbelief morphing quickly into anger. He raised his voice, a harsh bark that cut through the frantic noise. "Everyone back off!" he shouted, attempting to regain control of the situation. "I'm handling this." But his words fell flat, drowned out by the cries of concern and the fury of those around him. No one was listening to him anymore. Their focus was on Olivia, on the woman lying helpless and broken on the ground. How could this happen? How could a police officer sworn to protect do something so cruel, so senseless? The quiet peace of the morning had been shattered, replaced by a raw, electric tension. In the distance, the piercing wail of sirens grew louder, the sound a grim promise of help that felt almost too late. Olivia's world was slipping away, the pain too much to bear. She clung to the faint hope that her child would survive, her trembling lips still forming the same desperate plea. "She's pregnant! Be careful!" a voice called out as the ambulance pulled to a stop, its red lights casting a harsh glow on the chaotic scene. Paramedics rushed to her side, their faces etched with urgency and focus. They knelt beside her, their hands gentle but firm as they assessed her injuries. "Ma'am, we're here to help you," one of them said softly, trying to reassure her as they carefully lifted her onto a stretcher. Olivia winced, clutching her belly protectively, her mind a whirlwind of fear and pain. The paramedics exchanged quick glances, their calm professionalism masking the gravity of the situation. As the ambulance doors closed, taking Olivia away, the crowd turned their attention back to Kyle. His earlier confidence had vanished, replaced by a flicker of unease. The scene was spiraling out of his control, and he knew it. The sirens faded into the distance, leaving behind a street heavy with silence and dread. Fear and anger hung thick in the air, and one unanswered question seemed to echo in every mind. Why? Why had this happened? By the afternoon, the quiet town of Brooksville was buzzing with a fury that could not be contained. Videos captured by bystanders quickly spread online, capturing the horrifying moment when Officer Kyle attacked Olivia. Social media exploded in outrage. The hashtags Justice for Olivia and Stop Police Brutality trended nationwide, demanding action. People from all corners of the country shared their anger, their disbelief, demanding answers and accountability. Meanwhile, at the hospital, the atmosphere was tense and urgent. Olivia had been rushed into the emergency room, the pain unbearable, her mind clouded with fear and confusion. Doctors and nurses worked frantically around her, their voices calm but laced with urgency as they fought to stabilize her. Olivia's heart ached, not just from the physical trauma, but from the chilling terror that something might be wrong with her baby. Tears streamed down her face, her body shaking from the pain. She whispered again and again, as if the repetition could make it true, "Please, please let my baby be okay." The medical team moved quickly, their actions precise and practiced. Every second counted. Olivia's trembling hands cradled her swollen belly as she gasped desperately, "My baby." The words barely left her lips before the world around her blurred into darkness. Every fiber of her being willed her unborn child to survive, to fight through this nightmare. A nurse knelt beside her, her gloved hands warm and steady as she gently held Olivia's trembling fingers. "We're going to take care of you and your baby, okay?" she said softly, trying to keep her voice calm despite the urgency in her eyes. "You just need to stay strong." Olivia could only nod weakly, her body trembling as waves of pain racked through her. Her mind was a blur of panic and exhaustion, but she forced herself to pray, to hold on to the hope that her baby would make it through this. The doctors had given her the grim news. Her placenta had detached due to the violent trauma. The only chance to save her child was emergency surgery. There was no time to waste. The door to her hospital room burst open and a blur of movement filled the space. Maria, her best friend, rushed inside, her face etched with terror, fury, and heartbreak all at once. "Olivier!" Maria cried, rushing to her side, her voice raw with emotion. "Oh my God, are you okay?" Olivia tried to answer, but the pain made it difficult to form words. She swallowed hard, her lips trembling. "Maria, I'm scared," she managed to whisper, fresh tears slipping down her cheeks. Maria immediately grasped Olivia's hand, squeezing it tight as if willing her strength into her. "I'm here," she promised, her voice both firm and gentle. "I'm not going anywhere. We're going to get through this. You just focus on you and the baby right now, okay?" Olivia nodded, but no amount of reassurance could shake the terror gnawing at her soul. Moments later, the medical team arrived, moving swiftly to wheel Olivia into surgery. Maria followed, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, silently praying for a miracle. Daniel Carter sat in a high-rise conference room, the city skyline stretching behind him, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding back home. His phone buzzed against the sleek wooden table, and without glancing at the screen, he excused himself, assuming it was a routine message. Then he saw the name, Maria. His stomach dropped. Maria wouldn't call unless something was wrong. The moment he answered, his entire world shattered. "Daniel, you need to get to the hospital now." Maria's voice was frantic, choked with emotion. "It's Olivia, she's hurt. They're taking her into emergency surgery." The room around him seemed to blur. "What?" he breathed, his grip tightening around his phone. "What happened?" Maria's voice cracked. It was a cop, Officer Kyle. "He attacked her, Daniel. He kicked her. She was just going to the store." Daniel's blood ran cold. His breath came in short, controlled bursts as something dark and primal ignited inside him. "I'm on my way," he said, his voice low, deadly calm. Without another word, he bolted from the meeting, ignoring the confused glances of his colleagues. He didn't care. There was nothing else in the world that mattered right now except getting to his wife and child. Daniel was no ordinary businessman. What most people didn't know, what even Olivia only partially understood, was that he had spent years working deep in the shadows as a CIA operative trained to handle crises that most men wouldn't survive. But no mission, no enemy had ever made him feel this powerless. Because this wasn't an operation. This was his family. By the time Daniel landed in Brooksville and rushed to the hospital, his pulse was hammering against his ribs. His eyes scanned the waiting room frantically, his body wound so tight he could barely breathe. Then he saw Maria pacing outside the operating room, her face streaked with tears. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice sharp, barely controlled. Maria turned, her lips trembling. "She's still in surgery." Daniel clenched his fist so hard his knuckles turned white. He forced himself to sit, but his legs bounced with restless energy. He had been trained to analyze threats, to control situations, to plan 5 steps ahead, but none of that mattered right now. All he could do was wait. His voice was raw when he finally spoke again. "Who did this?" Maria hesitated, her eyes dark with fury and sadness. Then she said the name. "Officer Kyle Mercer." A storm settled over Daniel's face. "Where is he now?" Maria shook her head. "People are talking about it everywhere. There are videos, it's all over social media. But the police, they're protecting him. They're saying Olivia misunderstood his actions." Daniel's entire body stiffened, his jaw locking. His heart pounded, not just with grief, but with something else. Something far more dangerous. Hours passed, each minute feeling like an eternity. Then, finally, the doors to the operating room swung open. A doctor approached, his face weary but calm. "Mr. Carter?" Daniel shot to his feet. "How is she?" The doctor exhaled, nodding slightly. "Your wife is stable, but it was a difficult procedure. The trauma caused significant complications. We had to deliver the baby early." Daniel's breath caught. "The baby?" "He's in the neonatal unit," the doctor said, his voice gentle. "He's very small and will need constant monitoring, but he's alive. They both are." Daniel's legs nearly gave out, relief washing over him like a tidal wave. He could barely process it. The nightmare wasn't over, but they had survived. "Can I see her?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. The doctor nodded. "She's still recovering, but you can sit with her." Daniel didn't waste a second. He pushed through the doors and into the dimly lit hospital room where Olivia lay. She looked so fragile, so pale against the stark white sheets, But when she opened her eyes and saw him, fresh tears welled in her gaze. "Danielle." Her voice was weak, but filled with raw emotion. He was at her side instantly, taking her hand, pressing it against his lips. "I'm here," he murmured, his voice breaking. "You're safe. The baby is safe." Her lips trembled, and her body shook as she sobbed. "I tried to protect him," she whispered. Daniel's throat tightened, and he kissed her forehead gently. "You did. You fought for him, and you both survived." But as he held her close, his mind was already working, already planning. Because this wasn't over. The system might protect Kyle Mercer, but Daniel Carter had spent his life dismantling powerful men who thought they were untouchable. And Kyle had just made the gravest mistake of his life. David's fingers curled into tight fists at his sides as he stood in the cold, impersonal office of the police station. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the air thick with a suffocating sense of injustice. He struggled to keep his composure, though every muscle in his body screamed for action. "My wife did nothing wrong," he said, his voice low but firm, laced with barely contained fury. "She was attacked. There were witnesses. You've seen the videos." Across from him, the officer behind the desk barely lifted a shoulder in response, his expression unreadable. "The situation is still under review," he said, his tone dismissive, almost bored. Officer Mercer stated that she was resisting. He acted within his rights. David felt a slow, burning rage coil in his chest. He had dealt with corrupt officials before, had seen systems bend to protect their own, but this was personal. His wife, the mother of his child, had been brutalized, and they were sweeping it under the rug like it was nothing. His blood boiled, but he knew one thing for certain: the system was not going to help him. They were protecting Kyle Mercer, and if he wanted justice, he would have to take matters into his own hands. He turned sharply on his heel and left the station, his mind already calculating, strategizing. He had spent years operating in the shadows, navigating the murky world of intelligence and covert operations. He had taken down war criminals, dismantled underground networks, and handled high-stakes crises with precision. But this wasn't about an assignment or a mission. This was his family. As he stepped outside, his phone buzzed in his pocket. The screen lit up with messages and notifications, videos, headlines, and texts from friends and strangers alike. The entire world had seen what happened. Social media was ablaze with footage of Kyle Mercer's brutal assault, captured from every possible angle. The people were watching, and so was he. David exhaled slowly, his grip tightening around the phone. Then, without hesitation, he sent a single, quiet message, one that would activate a part of his life he had kept hidden for years. The hunt had begun. David returned to the hospital, moving silently through the dimly lit hallways. He stepped into Olivia's room, where she lay resting, her face pale, her breathing soft but steady. She stirred at the sound of his footsteps, her eyes fluttering open. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David forced a reassuring smile, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Everything's going to be fine," he said, his tone calm, soothing. But behind that calmness was something else, something cold and deadly. Because Kyle Mercer had no idea what was coming. Back at home, David was no longer the warm, gentle husband everyone knew. The softness in his eyes had been replaced with steely determination. He sat in his dimly lit study, the glow of his laptop screen casting shadows across his face. His fingers moved with practiced precision, pulling up classified databases, surveillance footage, and encrypted files. His phone rested on the desk beside him, vibrating occasionally with incoming messages. Each call he made was brief, precise, spoken in cryptic phrases that only those on the other end would understand. To an outsider, it would sound like a foreign language, but to David it was the language of his world, a world of intelligence, secrets, and silent power. As he hung up the final call, he leaned back in his chair, his mind already working through the next steps. David had spent years gathering intelligence, tracking threats, and outmaneuvering dangerous men. He knew how to expose weaknesses, how to dismantle power structures, how to make a man feel like the walls were closing in around him. And now, for the first time in his life, he was using those skills not for a government, not for a mission, but for something far more important. His wife, his child, his family. The next morning, Kyle Mercer woke to the blaring sound of his alarm clock. His head throbbed, a dull ache settling in his temples as he groggily swung his legs over the side of the bed. Something felt off, like a shadow lingering just out of sight. As he stepped outside to retrieve the morning paper, his stomach dropped. Scattered across his doorstep were several small envelopes and packages, each one addressed to him but with no return label. A deep frown creased his face as he bent down to gather them. At first, he thought they were just misplaced mail, but as he tore one open, his breath caught in his throat. Inside was a collection of printouts, documents he had thought were long buried. There were old complaints, cases where he had abused his power, allegations that had mysteriously disappeared from his record. Photos, too, images of him in places he had never realized he was being watched. Someone had been tracking his every move. His hands began to shake as he flipped through the pages. At the bottom of the stack lay a single note, its message bold and unforgiving. "We know everything." His breath hitched, his pulse hammered in his ears. Who had gotten access to these files? Who had been watching him? His hands trembled as he stumbled backward, scanning the empty street outside his window. Everything looked normal, but nothing felt normal anymore. Kyle stumbled backward, his pulse hammering. His eyes darted wildly around the quiet street, scanning the empty sidewalks, the parked cars, the rooftops. Was someone watching him right now? He rushed inside, slamming the door behind him, but even the walls of his home felt too thin to protect him. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He rushed back inside, slamming the door shut behind him. His breathing was rapid, shallow. For the first time in his life, Kyle Mercer felt real fear. And he had no idea that this was just the beginning. Kyle stumbled backward, his heart hammering against his ribs. His eyes darted around the empty street, scanning every shadow, every parked car, every window that might be hiding prying eyes. But everything looked normal. A little too normal. And that was the most unsettling part. His gut screamed at him. This wasn't just paranoia. Someone had been tracking him, watching him, and they wanted him to know it. For the first time in his life, Kyle Mercer felt true fear. As the day dragged on, the feeling didn't fade. It only got worse. He tried to convince himself that he was overreacting, that the note was some cruel joke, a bluff meant to rattle him, but the unease coiling inside him refused to loosen its grip. Then the little things started happening. When he went outside to start his car, the engine sputtered but refused to turn over. He tried again. Nothing. It was as if someone had tampered with it. His phone, his lifeline, began glitching, shutting off and restarting at random. Every time he attempted to make a call, the screen would flicker before going dark, refusing to connect. Messages disappeared, contacts were wiped. It was as if someone had reached into his device and stripped him of control. And then there was the car. At first he thought it was a coincidence, but as he watched from behind his living room curtains, he saw it again, an unmarked black sedan creeping past his house. It moved slowly, deliberately, before disappearing down the street. Minutes later, it returned, taunting him. His pulse quickened. The walls around him, once familiar and secure, now felt like a prison. He had always been the one with power, the one in control, but now? Now it felt like someone else was pulling the strings. Someone who wanted him to suffer. Determined to shake the feeling, Kyle forced himself to go to work, clinging to the rigid structure of his routine. But as soon as he walked through the doors of the precinct, he knew something was wrong. The usual nods of respect from his fellow officers were absent. Conversations hushed when he passed. Some officers barely glanced at him. Others exchanged quick, knowing looks before looking away. Kyle's stomach twisted. They knew, or at least they suspected something. He approached his superior, hoping for some kind of reassurance. Instead, he was met with cool indifference. The man barely acknowledged him, not even looking up from his paperwork. "You've made a mess, Kyle," he said flatly. "I suggest you clean it up before it gets worse." That was it. No support, no backup, no protection. They were already distancing themselves from him, afraid of getting caught in the fallout. Kyle's mouth went dry. He had seen this happen before, to other cops who had screwed up too badly, whose actions had become too public. The department never admitted wrongdoing. Instead, they let the problem solve itself, letting the officer in question self-destruct while they quietly stepped away. And now it was happening to him. By the time evening rolled around, Kyle was a wreck. He sat alone in his dimly lit living room, staring at the pile of documents, photos, and notes that had turned his life upside down. His hands were clenched into fists, his mind racing through every possible explanation, every possible way out. How do you fight an enemy you can't see? An enemy who seems to know everything about you, your routines, your past, your secrets? Then his phone buzzed. Kyle nearly jumped out of his skin. His hand shook as he picked it up, his breath catching in his throat when he saw the screen. No name, no number, just an unknown sender. The message contained only a single link. Kyle hesitated, a deep gnawing dread clawing at his gut, but he couldn't stop himself. He clicked. A video feed filled his screen. His own living room. Kyle's breath hitched, his fingers gripped the phone tighter. The camera angle was unfamiliar. Positioned from somewhere within the room itself, capturing everything. The furniture, the dim lighting, and him. Sitting there, watching. A chill slithered down his spine. Someone had been inside his house. The video continued to pan slowly, methodically, before stopping at a small, unfamiliar object on his coffee table. Kyle's blood turned to ice. A note. Kyle scrambled to his feet, his body moving on pure instinct as he rushed to the table. His hands trembled violently as he picked up the slip of paper, his vision blurring for a moment before the words came into focus. "Your time is running out." Kyle's breath came in quick, shallow bursts. His chest tightened. This wasn't a warning. This was a death sentence. Kyle's hands trembled violently, his grip unsteady as he clutched the note. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, his mind struggling to process the horrifying words staring back at him in bold, unforgiving ink. "You messed with the wrong family. Make things right, or the world will know everything you've done." A cold shudder ran down his spine, the weight of the message pressing into his chest like a vice. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out the silence of the empty house. Whoever this was, they weren't just watching him. They had been inside his home. Past his locks. Past his security system. Inside his most private space, moving undetected, leaving no sign of forced entry. It was an impossible level of precision and control, something beyond his comprehension. He prided himself on being the one in charge, the one who held power over others. But now? Now, he was the hunted. And whoever was behind this wasn't just seeking revenge. This was calculated, meticulous, the work of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, someone who had prepared for this moment long before Kyle had even realized he was a target. His hands shook so badly he could barely hold the note steady. His thoughts spiraled into chaos. Should he call the police? What would he even tell them? That someone had broken into his house without leaving a trace? That he was being watched? That someone out there knew all his secrets? They'd laugh him out of the station. Or worse, think he was losing his mind. And even if they did believe him, what could they do? Whoever was behind this had access, resources, power. This wasn't the work of some angry protester. This was something much, much bigger. The message was clear, and Kyle understood it with terrifying certainty. This was his last chance. Whoever was coming for him had the power to destroy him completely. His career, his reputation, his entire life could unravel in a matter of hours if they decided to act. Kyle felt his chest tighten with panic, his vision blurring at the edges. He had always been the one in control, the one making others afraid, but now, for the first time, he felt what it was like to be powerless. And the worst part was, he had no idea who was behind it. The suspense clawed at him, every second ticking by like a countdown to his downfall. Kyle knew he was running out of time. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. He had only one option left. He had to make this go away. Somehow, even if it meant facing his own fears. But as the video feed on his phone flickered and went dark, an overwhelming sense of helplessness crashed over him. For the first time in his life, Kyle Mercer had no idea what his next move should be. Meanwhile, miles away, Daniel Carter sat in his dimly lit study, his expression eerily calm as he watched the final seconds of the live feed disappear from his phone screen. Kyle had received the message. The fear in his eyes had been unmistakable. But would he act on it? That was the real question. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together in thought. He had given Kyle a chance to make things right. A single warning. If the officer was smart, he would take it. If not, well, Daniel had plenty of other plans up his sleeve, and he wasn't afraid to use them. Politicians, activists, and everyday citizens were demanding accountability. And now Kyle Mercer was stepping into the fire. Outside the police station, reporters gathered in swarms. Cameras were set up, microphones extended, waiting for the disgraced officer to speak. The murmurs of the crowd were tense, expectant. Then, finally, the doors swung open. Kyle stepped out, and the moment the crowd saw him, a hush fell over the area. Gone was the arrogant, aggressive cop they had seen before. The man standing before them looked like a ghost of himself. His complexion was pale, his face hollow with exhaustion. His usual rigid posture was gone, his shoulders slumped. His hands trembled as he adjusted the microphone. His eyes darted nervously across the sea of faces in front of him, as if searching for an unseen enemy lurking in the shadows. This was not a man who was here by choice. This was a man who had been forced to the podium. Kyle took a deep breath, attempting to steady himself, but it was clear to everyone watching he was struggling. When he finally spoke, his voice was weak, hesitant. I want to start by addressing the incident that happened a few days ago," he began, his words uneven, like a man barely keeping himself together. The cameras zoomed in, the world watching his every move. Kyle swallowed hard. For the first time, he understood what it meant to be truly afraid. Kyle took a shaky breath, gripping the sides of the podium as though it was the only thing keeping him standing. He could feel the weight of the crowd's eyes on him, the expectant silence pressing in around him like a suffocating fog. His throat felt dry, his voice barely above a whisper as he forced out the words. "What I did was wrong." A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. People exchanged stunned glances, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. This was the last thing anyone had expected to hear. Kyle swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he tried to keep his voice steady. I overstepped my authority," he admitted, his voice cracking under the weight of his own confession, "and I deeply regret my actions." The crowd grew louder, voices rising in hushed conversations. Reporters hastily scribbled notes, their cameras flashing, capturing every second of the momentous event. Kyle clenched the podium, his knuckles white. He exhaled slowly before forcing himself to continue. "I want to apologize," he said, turning his gaze toward the front row where Olivia Carter stood, her husband Daniel by her side. "To Olivia Carter and her family, I am sorry. I can never undo the pain I have caused, but He hesitated for a split second before letting the words spill from his lips. "I am resigning from the police force, effective immediately." Gasps rippled through the audience. For a beat there was stunned silence, Then, the eruption of whispered conversations. The press went wild, reporters leaning forward, scrambling to capture his every word. Camera flashes illuminated Kyle's pale, exhausted face, exposing the dark shadows under his eyes. In the midst of the chaos, Olivia stood frozen, clutching Daniel's hand so tightly her fingers trembled. She had come to this press conference expecting another round of excuses, another attempt to paint himself as the victim. But this? An apology? A resignation? Tears welled in her eyes, blurring her vision as she turned toward Daniel. He squeezed her hand in silent reassurance, his expression unreadable, but she could feel the tension in his grip. Kyle didn't wait for questions. As soon as he finished speaking, he turned away from the podium, ignoring the frantic shouts of reporters trying to press him for more details. His movements were stiff, almost robotic as he walked away, his face drained of color. The entire town watched him go. Speculation swirled like wildfire. What had forced him to resign? Why the sudden change of heart? Had the department pressured him? Or had something, or someone, pushed him to this breaking point? The truth remained unknown, but one thing was certain. Kyle Mercer's career was over, and Olivia Carter was finally getting the justice she deserved. That evening, as Olivia and Daniel returned home, the weight of the past few days slowly began to lift. The air still felt thick with unanswered questions, but for the first time in a long time, Olivia could breathe a little easier. She sat on the couch, exhaling as she ran a hand over her belly. The tension was fading, but the disbelief remained. She turned to her husband, her brows knitting together. "Daniel, how did this happen?" she asked, her voice soft but urgent. "Why would he just give up like that? I thought they were going to protect him." Daniel smiled, a slow, knowing smile. It was the kind of expression that had always reassured her, the one that made her feel safe no matter what storm was raging outside. But behind that calm demeanor, there was something else. Something unreadable. "Sometimes," he said gently, "people just need to see the consequences of their actions." He reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. She studied him carefully, searching for something more in his gaze, some hidden piece of the puzzle she couldn't quite grasp. "Daniel," she said slowly, "I've always known your job wasn't as simple as you said it was. You travel so much, you get strange calls at odd hours, but you've never told me exactly what you do." His smile didn't falter, but something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of sadness or maybe something deeper. "You don't have to worry about that, Olivia," he said softly. "My job is to keep you safe, to make sure our family is okay. That's all that matters." He squeezed her hand, and for a brief moment a sense of peace washed over her. She wanted to press further, to ask more questions, but deep down she knew Daniel. He had always protected her, and he always would. Later that night, after Olivia had gone to bed, Daniel sat alone in his office. The room was dark except for the dim glow of his phone, which vibrated quietly on the desk. He picked it up, his expression unreadable as he read the message that had just come through. "Everything has been taken care of. The reports are in. Higher authorities have been notified about Mercer's actions. He won't be able to hide from this." Daniel exhaled through his nose, his face giving nothing away as he typed a brief response. "Thank you." He set the phone down, but he didn't leave his office. Instead, he reached into a locked drawer and pulled out a small metal box, setting it on the desk in front of him. For a long moment, he simply stared at it. It had been years since he last opened it, but tonight felt different. Finally, he lifted the lid. Inside was a collection of carefully arranged documents, badges, and small objects that hinted at a life far more complex than anyone knew. There were photos from past missions, covert operations that had taken him across the globe, passports under different names, encrypted devices, each containing layers of intelligence that very few people had access to. And there, among the neatly stored files, was a single item that confirmed everything. A badge marked with 3 letters. CIA. Daniel stared at it for a long moment before slowly closing the lid and sliding the box back into the drawer, locking it once more. This had never been about justice. It had always been about sending a message that said loud and clear, "No one threatens my family and walks away unscathed." Daniel sat in the dim glow of his office, the only light coming from the desk lamp illuminating the small metal box before him. His fingers traced the edges of the lid, the weight of its contents heavier than it had ever been. He had locked this part of himself away long ago, but tonight it had demanded to be reopened. With a quiet breath, he lifted the lid. Inside lay remnants of a life Olivia had never truly known, a past he had kept hidden beneath the facade of a businessman. Documents marked with high-clearance seals, encrypted drives containing information that could dismantle governments, and a collection of meticulously forged passports, each one tied to an alias that no longer existed. And then, there it was, the single item that confirmed the truth. A badge, its surface worn but unmistakable, bearing the emblem of the Central Intelligence Agency. Beneath the insignia, his real name and title were engraved in cold, unyielding metal. Daniel exhaled slowly. He had spent years navigating the underbelly of the world, gathering intelligence, dismantling threats, and ensuring that those who stepped out of line met their inevitable fate. His skills had allowed him to manipulate outcomes, expose corruption, and control situations before they spiraled beyond his grasp. And now he had used those same skills for something far more personal. Kyle Mercer had learned the hard way. No one touches Daniel Carter's family and walks away unscathed. But Olivia would never know the lengths he had gone to protect her, and he intended to keep it that way. As he closed the box and slid it back into the drawer, locking it securely, his gaze drifted to the framed photo on his desk. It was Olivia, smiling, radiant, caught in a moment when life had felt simple and untouched by darkness. It was taken on a bright summer afternoon, long before the world had tried to break them. Daniel reached out, brushing his fingers against the edge of the frame, his eyes softening. She deserved a life free of fear, and he was determined to give her that, no matter what it took. The house was quiet as Daniel stepped into the bedroom, the soft rhythm of Olivia's breathing the only sound in the dimly lit space. She stirred slightly at his presence, her eyelids fluttering open just enough to meet his gaze. "Is everything okay?" she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel nodded, sinking onto the edge of the bed beside her. He reached out, resting a gentle hand on her belly, feeling the life growing within her. "Everything's fine," he assured her, his voice calm, steady, unshakable. "No one will ever hurt our family again." Olivia let out a slow breath, her lips curling into a small, tired smile, before her eyes slipped shut once more. The tension that had gripped her for days seemed to melt away, replaced by the quiet comfort of knowing that Daniel was there, watching over her, protecting her. As the camera panned away, the last image lingered, Daniel's hand resting protectively over Olivia's belly, his expression unreadable but resolute. It was more than a touch. It was a silent vow, a promise that he would always be there, watching, waiting, ready to act if needed. The screen fades to a dimly lit room, the office where Daniel had sat moments before. The metal box is now locked away, hidden from sight, but the weight of its contents lingers. The audience understands now. The man who seemed so calm, so controlled, was capable of extraordinary things, not for power, not for glory, but for love, for family. As the screen fades to black, the final words echo in the minds of those watching. Justice is not given, it is taken. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey. We hope this story moved you as much as it moved us, reminding us all of the strength, love, and resilience that can overcome even the darkest moments. If this story resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more compelling content. Your support allows us to continue bringing you stories that captivate and inspire. Until next time, stay safe and take care.